Yes, we can't cure rabies. Not once symptoms start. Not with a ventilator, not with antivirals, not with the best ICU on Earth. The pitch keeps circulating anyway. Monoclonal antibodies, gene therapy, some future antiviral cocktail, all promising a finish line. That pitch runs on a category error. Rabies isn't a disease waiting for a better drug. It is a virus that has spent millions of years evolving one specific skill: traveling through your own nervous system while staying completely invisible to the immune cells patrolling everywhere else in your body. By the time you can diagnose it from symptoms, that skill has already finished its job. In 1885, Louis Pasteur cured a 9-year-old boy of rabies for the first time in recorded history. 141 years later, roughly 59,000 people still die of it every year, one person every 9 minutes, and once the first symptom appears, the survival count for the entire planet sits somewhere in the single digits. The reason isn't that medicine hasn't tried, it's that we've been fighting a virus that only needs to win a race, not a war, and by the time you know you're racing, it already crossed the finish line weeks ago. There's no reliable test that catches rabies before symptoms start either. Standard blood work won't flag it. A biopsy of the bite site won't show it traveling. For most of medical history, the only definitive proof came after death, from negri bodies, the distinctive clumps inside infected brain cells first identified by Italian pathologist Adelchi Negri in 1903 while examining tissue under a microscope in Pavia. That diagnostic method is still referenced in textbooks over a century later, which tells you something about how little the fundamental problem has moved. You are, in the early weeks after a bite, essentially undiagnosable and asymptomatic at the same time the virus is actively climbing toward your brainstem. Start with the number everyone gets wrong. Rabies has a case fatality rate once symptoms begin that sits above 99.9%, making it arguably the most lethal infectious disease on the planet, deadlier than Ebola, deadlier than untreated plague. And yet, in the same breath, rabies is almost completely preventable. A course of vaccine given after a bite, before symptoms start, works nearly every time. So the honest framing isn't, "we can't cure rabies," it's, "we have a closing window, and once it shuts, nothing on Earth reopens it." Understanding why that window slams shut so completely, and why it stays shut, means understanding what the virus is actually doing to your body while you feel nothing at all. Here's the mechanism, step by step, and it's the whole story. A bite delivers rabies virus into muscle tissue, not the bloodstream. That's the first quiet decision the virus makes, and it's a deliberate one. Blood is patrolled constantly by antibodies and immune cells. Muscle, comparatively, is not. From there, the virus needs to find a nerve ending, and it does this using a receptor called P75NTR, the same receptor nerve growth factor normally uses to signal the brain. Researchers at Weizmann Institute of Science tracked individual virus particles in live neurons and found something remarkable. Rabies virus doesn't just hijack this receptor's transport system, it travels faster along it than the neuron's own natural cargo. Once inside the axon, the virus commandeers dynein, the motor protein responsible for retrograde transport, the machinery a nerve cell normally uses to send signals back toward its own cell body. The virus rides that machinery in the wrong direction, backward, up the nerve, toward your spinal cord and brain. This is the part almost nobody understands about rabies. For the entire journey from bite site to brain, which can take anywhere from roughly 20 to 90 days depending on how far the wound is from the head, the virus is not floating in your blood where antibodies could find it. It is sealed inside nerve cells the whole way, a closed pipeline your immune system essentially cannot inspect. A bite on the face might reach the brainstem in under a week. A bite on the ankle can take months, because the virus is limited to the speed of axonal transport, roughly the length of your leg's longest nerve, crawled one motor protein step at a time. That incubation gap is the only reason the vaccine works at all. It is a race between a virus walking up your nerves and a vaccine trying to prime your immune system before the virus arrives. Once the virus reaches the central nervous system, it doesn't just infect and multiply. It actively disarms the alarm system. Recent work reviewed in a 2024 paper on rabies virus pathogenicity mechanisms shows that wild or street strains of the virus produce proteins that block interferon induction, the signaling molecule cells use to warn their neighbors that a virus is present. Lab-weakened strains, the kind used to make vaccines, trigger a strong interferon response and usually get cleared. Wild rabies doesn't let that alarm sound in the first place. On top of that, infected cells are supposed to self-destruct early through apoptosis, sacrificing themselves before the virus can finish replicating. Street rabies delays that self-destruct sequence, buying itself extra time to spread to neighboring neurons before anything notices. And then there's the detail that explains why even a fully vaccinated immune system, one that has built antibodies, still can't save you once symptoms begin. Research out of Thomas Jefferson University, led by Anirban Roy and Douglas Hooper, and published in the Journal of Neurovirology, found that the deadliest rabies strains all share one trait. They keep the blood-brain barrier closed. Your brain is normally sealed off from your circulating immune system by design. Tight junctions between blood vessel cells that block most molecules, including antibodies, from crossing. When the immune system successfully clears rabies in lab experiments, it's specifically because that barrier opens up and lets antibodies in. Wild rabies strains actively prevent that barrier from opening. Roy and Hooper's team showed antiviral immunity can develop completely normally out in the rest of the body. Full antibody titers, activated T cells, everything textbook medicine would want to see, and the patient still dies, because none of it can physically get into the brain tissue where the virus is now living. It's not that your immune system loses the fight. It's that the virus locks the door to the arena before the fight can start. That is the entire reason post-exposure treatment stops working the moment symptoms appear. Every plan modern medicine has, vaccines, antibody infusions, antivirals, depends on stopping the virus in the body before it enters that sealed compartment. Once it's inside, you're trying to deliver a treatment through a wall the virus itself is holding shut. And once symptoms do arrive, they arrive fast, and they arrive in a very specific order that traces the virus's own path through the nervous system. First, there's tingling or itching at the original bite site, sometimes weeks after the wound itself has fully healed, a signal that the virus has reached local nerve endings again on its way back out. Then fever, headache, anxiety that feels disproportionate to anything happening around the patient. Within days, the disease usually splits into one of two forms. The furious form brings agitation, hallucinations, and the disease's most infamous symptom, hydrophobia, violent throat spasms triggered by the sight or even the thought of water, because swallowing requires exactly the brainstem coordination the virus has by now compromised. The paralytic form is quieter and gets misdiagnosed more often, a slow ascending weakness that looks like Guillain-Barré syndrome until it isn't. Either way, once the brain is involved, death from cardiac or respiratory failure typically follows within days, occasionally a couple of weeks, with aggressive intensive care. There is no version of this disease's natural history where the virus reaches the brain and then negotiates. Now the historical angle, because this isn't a story about failure to try. On July 6, 1885, Louis Pasteur treated Joseph Meister, a 9-year-old boy from Alsace who had been bitten 14 times by a rabid dog. Pasteur had never tested his rabies treatment on a human being. He gave the boy 13 injections over the following 10 days, using spinal cord material from infected rabbits, progressively less weakened with each dose. Meister survived, becoming the first documented person ever successfully treated for rabies exposure. The achievement was so significant it led directly to the founding of the Pasteur Institute in 1888. That's the origin of modern post-exposure prophylaxis, and the core logic hasn't changed in 141 years. Get ahead of the virus before it reaches the nervous system, and you win. Miss that window, and Pasteur's method, and every method since, becomes irrelevant, which makes the modern death toll almost harder to sit with than the biology. In 2015, the World Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the Global Alliance for Rabies Control jointly launched a campaign called 0 by 30, targeting 0 human deaths from dog-mediated rabies by the year 2030. The tools required already exist and have existed for over a century. Vaccinating 70% of a region's dog population reliably collapses transmission to humans. A dog vaccine costs roughly $4. The human post-exposure vaccine series costs around $108, often more than a month's income in the countries hit hardest. An estimated 59,000 people still die from rabies annually, 40% of them children in Asia and Africa. Almost entirely from dog bites, almost entirely preventable, almost entirely a distribution and funding failure rather than a scientific one. The biology solved this problem in 1885. The economics of getting a $4 vaccine into enough dogs and a life-saving series into every bitten child before symptoms start still hasn't. Even public health officials working directly on the campaign have started saying the quiet part out loud, acknowledging that hitting 0 by the original 2030 deadline is now unlikely, while still defending the target as the thing forcing governments to fund the work at all. Mexico became the first country in the world validated by WHO for eliminating dog-transmitted rabies as a public health problem. Proof the model works when it's actually funded end-to-end. It just hasn't been funded end-to-end almost anywhere else. Now for the part that upends everything you'd expect. If rabies really is a virus this good at evading immune systems, some animals should be catastrophically vulnerable to it. Instead, bats carry it around asymptomatically for years. Bats are the natural reservoir for the majority of the world's lyssaviruses, the viral family rabies belongs to. And unlike humans, dogs, or nearly any other mammal, many bat species can be infected with rabies and simply not get sick. Researchers, including Alvaro Aguilar-Setien, demonstrated that vampire bats, Desmodus rotundus, could survive an experimental rabies challenge and continue shedding live virus in their saliva for more than 2 years without ever showing a symptom. In Europe, a related virus called European bat lyssavirus 1 causes no apparent disease at all in its bat hosts, according to research on infected serotine bat populations, even though it's responsible for the overwhelming majority of human lyssavirus exposures on the continent. A 2021 review in Nature on bat host defenses points to roughly 64 million years of evolutionary pressure that shaped bat immune systems to tolerate viral infection rather than fight it head-on, dampening the inflammatory response that, in humans, would otherwise cause massive collateral damage. It's the inverse of Peto's paradox in cancer, where bigger animals should get more cancer but don't. Here, the animal best equipped to carry one of the deadliest viruses on the planet is the one evolution built to simply not notice it's infected. Which brings us to the closest thing rabies has to a miracle cure, and the uncomfortable truth about what happened to it. In 2004, Rodney Willoughby, an infectious disease specialist at Children's Hospital of Wisconsin, was treating 15-year-old Jonna Giese, who had been bitten by a bat, and didn't seek treatment until neurological symptoms appeared 37 days later. With no approved treatment for symptomatic rabies, Willoughby made a judgment call. He chemically induced a coma using ketamine and midazolam paired with antiviral drugs, theorizing that shutting the brain down might limit the damage long enough for her own immune system to catch up. Giese survived, becoming the first documented person to survive symptomatic rabies without ever receiving the vaccine. The approach became known as the Milwaukee Protocol, and for years it was treated as proof that symptomatic rabies could, occasionally, be beaten. That optimism hasn't held up. A commentary published in 2025 and covered widely in early 2026, titled Demise of the Milwaukee Protocol, reviewed everything that's happened since Giese's case and found at least 64 documented failed attempts using the protocol, with no other proven survival that meets the same standard of evidence. The authors argue the protocol should be abandoned entirely, suggesting Giese's survival likely had more to do with the intensity of her critical care, and possibly a weaker viral strain, than the specific drug combination that got her name attached to a medical first. Willoughby disputes this, pointing to additional survivors he considers successes. But the field's confidence has clearly cracked. The treatment that once looked like a functioning cure for symptomatic rabies now looks, to a growing number of researchers, like one extraordinary outlier that medicine spent 2 decades trying and mostly failing to reproduce. So here's where that leaves the actual ceiling. We know exactly how rabies kills, step by step, at the molecular level, arguably better than we understand most cancers. We've had a functioning preventive treatment since 1885. A full 9 years before the word virus even had a settled scientific definition. And we still cannot reliably save a single person once the virus finishes its climb up the nervous system and locks the blood-brain barrier shut behind it. Not because nobody's tried. Rodney Willoughby tried, and 1 patient survived, and the following 2 decades of attempts mostly returned the same silence. The ceiling here isn't a funding gap or a research gap. It's a virus that spent longer evolving its escape route than our entire species has existed, and it only needs 20 to 90 days of head start to win permanently. Every year, somewhere on Earth, a child is bitten by a dog and doesn't tell anyone because the wound looks small and doesn't hurt for long. Somewhere in that child's leg right now, if the bite was rabid, something is already climbing.